All right, hello everyone. I'm Courtney Forehand, the Training and Marketing Specialist for the Colorado Municipal League. Thank you for attending today's webinar. This webinar is being recorded and we will post it to our website by the end of this week. For those of you who are not familiar with the webinar format, you should see a control panel on the top right of your screen. You have an orange arrow to the left of the panel, which will minimize the entire box. All participants will be muted for this webinar, but we encourage you to ask questions by typing them into the question box on the control panel. We will hold a Q&A near the end of the webinar. Please feel free to type your questions into that control panel as you think of them throughout the presentation. CMCA is offering 0.5 credits per webinar towards the CMC or MMC designation for member clerks who are attending. To obtain this credit, you will need to complete the assessment found on the CML website and submit it to cmcaclerks@gmail.com. Our presenter today is Karen Goldman. Karen is the former Karen is the former Deputy City Clerk of Aurora and has been offering insight and guidance to clerks across Colorado for the past several years through the Municipal Clerk Advisor Program, sponsored by CML, CIRSA, and CMCA. Karen is very active on our clerks listserv, and she is the primary author of the election book, hot off the presses and recently mailed to all clerks in the CML member municipalities. We're so grateful to have Karen with us here today, and this time I'm going to turn things over to her.
Good afternoon, welcome, and I don't think I told everybody Happy New Year. I'll tell you, the days are running one into the other for me these days. I'm sure that's true with you. So today what we're going to do is we're going to cover a couple of topics. We're going to first of all talk about canceling the election, and then for those of you who are doing mail ballot style elections, we're going to talk about the signature verification process. Now, all of you participating today should have received a set of today's slides along with 3 other signature verification documents, which we'll talk about later. And so for those of you who are not conducting mail ballot elections, because I want to make sure I have enough time to cover both of these topics, we will be holding off until the end of this webinar with the Q&A. And so you're going to have to sit through the signature verification piece. And while you're doing that, you can be either glad that you're not running a mail ballot election or you can wish you were. So having said that, let's get started. So I just need to make sure. Okay. All right, so we're first of all going to talk about canceling the election, when, how, and why we do it. So you can cancel an election under certain circumstances, and here are the requirements for being able to cancel your election. First of all, you must have already adopted an ordinance that does 2 things. The first thing is that it requires the filing of an affidavit of intent to be a write-in candidate in order for a person's name to be written in on the ballot. And in addition to that, it includes the cancellation of the election as follows. First of all, the only matter before the voters is the election of officers. So if in April you have a ballot item on your ballot, either a ballot issue or a ballot question, you cannot cancel your election because you have something on the ballot that is in addition to the election of officers. Additionally, at the close of business on the 64th day before the election, which is approximately a week after the nomination petitions are to be turned in, there are not more candidates than offices to be filled. And that includes person filing affidavits of intent to be a write-in candidate. So when you look at your ordinance, there is a provision regarding write-in candidates that says that a person has to file to be a write-in candidate prior to the 64th day. I think it's prior to the 64th day before the day of the election. So when the 64th day of the election shows up, and let's say you've got a mayor and 4 council or board members, mayor and 3 board members, and all you have is 1 candidate for mayor and 3 people or fewer running for the board, and you have this ordinance, then you can cancel the election. And the way you do it is that the governing body adopts a resolution declaring the election canceled and declaring the candidates to be elected. Now, let's go back to this whole issue of who's on the ballot. If you elect a mayor from the citizens at large, and the mayor's position is different from the board, if you have a race in the office of mayor and you do not have races in the office of board members, in other words, if you've got 3 positions on the ballot and you have 3 or fewer candidates, even though if you have a race in the office of mayor, you must include all positions and all candidates on the ballot. Conversely, if your mayor, or if there is running unopposed, or if there's only 1 candidate for mayor, but there are more people running for the position of board than you have positions available, you still have to have an election, including the office of mayor, for which there is only 1 person. So that's how it works. You cannot cancel the election in part, which means it's everything or it's nothing. I'm sure we'll have questions about that. So this kind of repeats a couple things that I've already said. You cannot cancel the election without having previously adopted such an ordinance. Now, I believe most municipalities have adopted such an ordinance. If you haven't adopted this ordinance, it's probably too late for this April election for you to be able to adopt one, unless your board can do it prior to the 64th day before the day of the election, which is coming up pretty soon. I believe the nomination petitions are due next Monday or Tuesday. So if you don't have an ordinance, the municipality has to provide the opportunity for persons to become write-in candidates whenever they choose to. And they don't have to notify you that they're going to be a write-in candidate. Let's say 2 weeks before the election, somebody takes a look at the candidate list, thinks, well, I can do better than this, decides he's going to be a write-in candidate, goes around the town saying, vote for me, don't vote for anybody on the ballot, write in my name. That's allowed if you do not have an ordinance. The reason for the ordinance is to allow for the cancellation of the election. That's the purpose of the ordinance. As I said, no election can be canceled in part. It's all or nothing, even if there are no races in some of the positions. Then, in accordance with statute, you publish notice of the cancellation and you post it at your polling place, which may be just your town hall, and in not less than 1 other public place. And it would just be a notice that the election has been canceled. So, so that's another thing you have to do. Now, I want you to pay attention to the note, and I want to explain this because we do get a lot of questions about the requirement that there be blank lines listed on the ballot. If you have the ordinance dealing with write-in and canceling the election, it means that even if an election is held, anybody's name that's written on the ballot who did not file a notice of intent, their names do not have to be counted. So if you look at statute, the purpose of the blank line is to allow any eligible person to have their name written in on the ballot. If you have the ordinance, then an eligible person is simply a person who's filed a notice of intent to be a write-in candidate. If you do not have the ordinance, then anybody who's registered to vote and meets the requirements for being a candidate of office can be considered to be an eligible elector. So I'm going to pause here, let you think about it. And if we have questions at the end about it, I certainly understand. So this is in basically what I said. If you have an ordinance, there has to be a notice of intent filed prior to 64 days before the day of the election. Without an ordinance, no affidavit of intent is required, and any name can be written in, and anybody can declare themselves to be a write-in candidate at any time. With an ordinance, if you have eligible persons, those people who filed affidavits, you have as many blank lines as there are positions to be voted on. If you're voting on 3 people, you have 3 blank lines. If you have 5 people, there are 5 blank lines. If there are no eligible write-in candidates, there are no blank lines. And then without an ordinance, at the end of the list, you have as many blank lines as there are positions to be voted on. This just puts in writing what I have previously said. So hopefully this will help you. All right. The other thing that's important to talk about, and this is a question that comes up a lot, and this I think is sometimes very confusing for people, is how do you deal with vacancies in office following the cancellation of the election? Okay, so an election can be canceled, I will say this again, if there are the same number of candidates as there are positions to be voted on, or if there are fewer candidates than there are positions to be voted on. There are no double candidates for mayor. There's no more candidates than there are offices, and all you're voting on is the election of candidates. So when the number is the same, candidate by resolution shall be declared elected for the full term. So let me go back to this again. When the number of candidates is the same as the number of available full-time offices, everybody whose name is on the ballot, once the election is canceled, shall be declared to be elected to a full term. When the number of candidates running is fewer than the number of available for full-term offices, the same thing happens, except now you have a vacancy, and the vacancy is filled in accordance with state statute, which is either by appointment or election. And I want to note that the persons declared elective do not take office until the current terms expire. Even if you cancel the election, those people who are currently sitting on your board get the opportunity to complete their term. And then once their term is up, the elected people can be sworn in. So you don't shorten the term just because you would cancel the election. Okay, so here are the procedures following appointments to vacant positions. And this is important too when we talk about canceling the election. Any person appointed to fill a position that is made vacant due to resignation must run at the next regular municipal election. So here's the best way to think about it. If somebody resigns, we're talking about 4-year terms here, and I think most of the municipalities have 4-year terms. So in a place where there are 4-year terms, if a person fills a vacancy in the first 2 years of that 4-year term, then that position, not necessarily the person filling the position, but that position would be on the next ballot. And that is basically the second bullet under this first item. So, and it would be for a shortened term, it's a mid-term election. If a person is appointed to fill a vacancy sometime in the second half of a 4-year term, then the next election is the election where that position would normally be voted on. And so that position on the ballot is for a 4-year term. I've talked to a lot of clerks who've said, well, on our ballot in April, we've got 4-year and 2-year terms. And my response is, I am assuming the 2-year terms are as a result of having to fill a vacancy. And sometimes the answer is a positive, definite yes, and sometimes they're not sure. And the reason they're not sure is because good records have not been kept to figure out when the person filling the vacancy, whose position that they're filling and how long that person's been on the ballot and that kind of thing. So it is absolutely critical. I can't emphasize this enough. It is absolutely critical that you keep good records. And if your predecessor, if you're new and your predecessor isn't the person who's done that, you have to go back to figure this out. Because normally what would happen in an election where you have 4-year terms and your mayor is elected also for 4-year terms, on one election, normally 1/2 of your board positions would be on the ballot. So if you have 6 positions, you would have 3 plus, and may or may not have the mayor depending upon when the mayor's term ends. But because it's so difficult finding people to run for office, and because a lot of people, once they get into office, realize they'd rather do something else, they resign. What we're seeing more and more are elections where we have both full and shortened terms. All right, so I'm going to go back and repeat this page so that everybody can understand how it goes. If the election is one where the position would normally be voted on, then that position on the ballot would be for full term. If the election is not the one where the position would normally be voted on, then that position would be for a shortened term, a 2-year term, okay? And remember, again, it's the position and not the person. I've had questions like, Sally got appointed and she's going to run in the next election and that position is for 2 years. If she wins, is she going to get the 2-year term? Well, the answer is no, unless she was the lowest vote getter. If she was the person who got the least number of votes, then yes, she would get the 2-year term. But if she got more votes than anybody else, she would get a 4-year term. I'm going to pause here. I know this can be confusing. The important thing is that when your folks are circulating their nomination petitions, and on your ballot you're going to have full-term and shortened term positions, your candidates don't run for office based on whether they don't circulate petitions based on whether they want to seek a full or a shortened term. That determination is made by the voters, which brings us to another kind of interesting thing, which I hope is on the next page. Here, and it is. Okay, so in an election where the only matter before the voters is the election of officers, and we have both full and shortened terms, the statute says that the highest vote getters get the full terms, and then followed by the people who get a lesser number of votes, and they get the shortened terms. The highest voters get the full terms. Now, let's say you have a situation where you have 3 full-time or full term and 1 shortened term position on the ballot, and you have 4 candidates. Now, technically, you have the same number of candidates as you have positions to be voted on. And technically, in a situation like that, you can cancel an election. However, because you have both full and shortened terms, the question is, can you really cancel the election? This is a question not for me to answer. This is a question not necessarily for your fellow clerks to answer. This is a question to be answered by your attorney. I'm going to give you my perspective as a non-attorney and from kind of an operational standpoint. By law, the answer is no, because who gets the longer term or the shorter term is determined by the voters. So even if you had 4 people running for 4 terms, if those terms are different, you still have to go ahead and hold the election in order to determine who gets the full and who gets the shortened terms. I am aware that there are clerks out there who, hopefully in coordination with their attorneys, have said, it seems to be silly to spend the money on an election where everybody who's on the ballot is going to get elected. So perhaps there is a way that we can cancel the election and figure out who gets the full and who gets the shortened terms. It is my position that if your attorney is willing to approve this approach, what you would need to do, in my opinion, and again, this is just my opinion and not a legal suggestion, that once your attorney is okay with this approach and you have the approval of all the people who are on the ballot, what you might be, excuse me, what you might be able to do is draw the names by lot. Put either their names in and the first 3 people up get the full terms, or put 4, 4, 4, and 3 on 4 different, or 4, 4, 4, and 2 on 4 different pieces of paper and draw the number of terms. But I think that everybody would have to agree that that's the way to do it. And obviously the reason you would do it is to save money. But again, this is something that you need to discuss with your attorney. I've had conversations with fellow clerks and who have said to me, well, that's illegal. Well, it's not legal. I don't know if it's illegal, but it clearly isn't what the statute anticipates. So that is definitely a question for your attorney. All right, we've done with signature verification, and if I've confused you royally, then my job is done. I'm sorry, we've done with canceling the election, and if I've confused you royally, then my job here is done. And if you have some questions, you're not quite sure what I have said, please ask some questions, type them in, and we'll get them answered at the end. Now, signature verification. Signature verification, what we are talking about when we, let me back up. When we check signatures, we are doing one of 2 things. On petitions, whether they be nomination petitions, referendum, initiative, or recall petitions, when we say we are verifying signatures or we are checking signatures, what we are doing is making sure that persons who sign these petitions are eligible to sign the petitions, and they are eligible to sign if the name and the address that they put on these petitions matches the name and the address in the voter registration database in SCORE. And we talked about this a lot at the last webinar. What we're looking for is matching the name and the address, and of course short names, nicknames, can apply. That's what we talk about when we are checking signatures on petitions, and people will also call that signature verification. But what we are talking about here is verifying that the signature on the back of a return mail ballot envelope, the way that people sign their name, matches the way that they have signed their names on documents maintained by the Secretary of State's office and located through the Secretary of State's office by using the DEO, Designated Election Official database. So this is the distinction. So signature verification became the law of the land for municipal mail ballot elections in 2016 with House Bill 1070. The signature verification, even though the bill was approved in 2016, implementation was delayed until 2018 to give time for the Secretary of State's office to work with the Municipal League on a procedure that will allow us access, read-only access to the statewide voter registration database, which is known as SCORE. So municipal clerks can access SCORE through the designated election read-only lookup, and your access must be renewed every 90 days. And the link to filling out the online application is listed here. Don't lose this, because this is pretty important to find. If otherwise, you have to go through a number of steps in order to get to this particular link. All right, the procedures are pretty simple. The signatures, again, the way people sign their names must be verified by an election judge. And it is the clerk's responsibility to train their judges in the signature verification process. You need 3 election judges for this process. And your signature verification judges can also be used as ballot counting judges. You know, all of that depends on how many mail ballots you send out and how many you anticipate returning. And if you're a small community and you don't have a whole lot of active registered electors who get the ballots, then the judges can do both of these processes. And signature verification is the very first step in processing the ballots after the ballots have been received and checked in as returned. This part is really important here. When the Secretary of State's office created this procedure for us to use, I was told to make sure that everybody understood that looking at how people sign their name is only to be used for the mail ballot return envelope process. And you cannot use the portion of the DEO access dealing with the signatures as a means to qualify or disqualify persons who signed nomination, initiative, a referendum, or recall petitions. And signature verification is not done for absentee ballots. And usually most absentee ballots are in a polling place election, or UOCAVA ballots, which in and of themselves are absentee ballots. So please be aware of that. Even if your board is kind of hot for you to do it, you have to let them know that you are prohibited by law from doing that. If the law changes, that's another thing, but for right now, we cannot use it except for using them for the return envelopes in mail ballot elections. All right, so when you are looking at comparing signatures, these are some of the elements for review and how you can determine if the signatures are the same. And I will tell you, having done signature verification, and I think those of you out there who've done signature verification probably will attest to the fact that it's not that hard to figure out if those signatures match. And in fact, almost 100% of the signatures can be matched in any kind of election. This was statistics that the Secretary of State came up with after they began the process themselves. It's something like 93, 94% can be verified first time. And what you will have access to are the 3 most current signatures, mostly voting, motor vehicle, any process that involves the county clerk's office. So one of the first elements you look for is how the name is slanted. Does the name as written slant to the right? Does it slant to the left? I know some people who are left-handed slant theirs to the left. Is it vertical? So that's one. The size or the scale of the signature. Do people sign their name really big, or do they sign their name really small? Is the first letter of their name ginormous and the rest of it not so small? So you look at size and scale. The individual letter characteristics. Is the first letter of their name very easy to distinguish, and are the rest of the letters more like horizontal lines? I know in my name, my N on both my first and my last name, I have a long tail that goes out to the right. and then how the letters are connected top to bottom. For example, in my first name, my AREN in my first name are not actually attached to my first letter K. And my G in my last name is just a very large size example of a lowercase g. So those are the kinds of things you can figure out. The Secretary of State's office puts out a training manual that you can use. And one of the things I like about it is that there's a little test in the back. What they did was they had a bunch of their staff write the word state twice and then put it all over a piece of paper. And you're to identify which two of the signatures match, and that will help you to do that. It is not that difficult. Okay. So once you're looking at the signatures, here's how it works. Judge number one reviews the signatures on his or her own. If the signatures match, then the ballots are put aside for the counting process. If the judge looking at comparing the signatures determines that the signatures do not match, then the other two of your three judges together take a look at the return envelope and the signature in the Secretary of State database in SCORE, and they do it jointly. If they disagree with the first judge and they say, no, we believe that these signatures do match, or if only one of those two judges says, no, I think these signatures do match, the ballots are counted. The idea, as always, is to err on the side of the voter. And in fact, when we were proposing this piece of legislation before the House State Affairs Committee, most of the comments from the legislators sitting up on the dais were that they wanted to be sure that the signatures were included as opposed to excluded. So again, if the first judge says no, but the other two or one of the other two says yes, then the ballots can be counted. However, if the two additional judges agree with the first judge that the signatures do not match, then there is a process that you go through again to see if you can include that ballot in the count. And here's how you do it. First of all, you have to, there is a letter that is sent out along with a form, and in the materials that you were sent today from the Municipal League, a sample letter and a sample form were included. These were documents from that the Secretary of State's office and the county clerks use, and we were given permission to use that if we needed it. So within 3 days of the date the signature deficiency has been confirmed, and remember, you can start this process up to 15 days prior to the day of the mail ballot election. And for those that have been determined to be, I call them discrepant, on the election day, no later than 2 days after, you send a letter and the form to the voter confirming that the elector did return the ballot. The letter basically says we either can't match a signature or there was no signature. And I'll talk about that piece in just a moment. So you ask them to send a form confirming that basically says, yes, I did send in a ballot, and they return their ID with it. And as long as that form is returned with the ID within 8 days after the day of the election, and they said, yes, I did vote a ballot, the ballot can be counted. In a mail ballot election that I helped on, we wound up sending out, I think it was 19, I call them discrepant signature letters, and we didn't get any back. And although we don't know why we didn't get any back, could have been for a couple of reasons. The first reason, which is the one I like to believe is the reason, is we were right. Whoever signed the back of the envelope was not the person to whom the signature belonged. Or, and this could also be a case, is that people were annoyed. They already voted. They, were done. They didn't want to file this form. and they didn't care that their ballot wasn't going to get counted. But that's kind of what happens. Now, I did say that the form says either there is a missing signature or we can't match your signatures. So prior to signature verification, in statute, there was the ability for somebody who neglected to sign their return envelope. There was a procedure that would allow them to come in and sign their return envelope so that their ballot can be counted. That process and that procedure predated implementation and initiation of signature verification. That's why the form letter contains both of those things. So if you get a ballot where the return to you where there was no signature, you can also use this letter to get that person's ballot eligible to be counted. Okay. So the second set of judges cannot agree on whether the signatures matches. In other words, one says yes and one says no. The ballot shall be deemed sufficient and the ballot counted. In addition to the letter and the form, there is a log that has to be kept. And I also, along with the PowerPoint slides and the form and the letter, I sent you a very elemental Excel spreadsheet that you can adapt however you want it, that you would use as your log. You put in there the name of the elector, their ID number, which if you've printed it on the back of the return envelope, you'll have it there, or you can get it from your DEO access, and what you did with it. For example, my name, signature didn't match, sent to second set of judges, and you can have columns like this. Judges okayed, signature, ballot counted, or letter sent, date letter sent, date letter returned, ballot counted, those kinds of things. But the idea is you have to keep a log on what you did and how you did it. You can't just send these things off. I'm guessing that in past mail ballot elections, there might have been some clerks who weren't unaware of this procedure, these forms and these documents, and didn't do this. So start now. That's what I would suggest. Okay. If an elector inadvertently returns the ballot in an envelope of another household member, you know, a husband and a wife or a mother and a daughter sign the wrong envelope, they're voting together and they put their ballot in the wrong and they sign it, the ballot can be counted if it's otherwise valid. In other words, if the signature on the return envelope matches the signature and score. So if a woman was to sign the envelope of somebody else in the house, as long as those signatures matched, the ballot can be counted because it's the ballot inside the envelope that belongs to that person. The only time obviously it wouldn't work is that if the one person signed all the envelopes for everybody in their household. Confidential voters. What will happen is when you go to look up your confidential voters, or when you go, well, let me back up. Sometimes what will happen is when you type in a person's name, no information is going to show up. Now, they got a ballot in the mail, so obviously they're on the county's voter registration list. They're in the voter registration database. They're active. If they weren't on the list and they weren't active, they never would have been sent a ballot. But when you go to check the information and nothing shows up, chances are the reason nothing shows up is because they are considered to be a confidential voter. Now the question is, why would anybody want to be a confidential voter, and how do you become one? Well, I believe you pay a fee, and I think the fee is $5, and you become a confidential voter because the voter registration records are public information, and you have chosen to not let a whole lot of different people have access to your voter information. where you live, what party you belong to, whether you voted in the last election. All that information is public. Obviously, how you voted is not public, and nobody knows that information other than you unless you tell somebody else. But they are confidential. A lot of times law enforcement personnel are confidential. Elected officials are confidential voters. I even know some municipal clerks who are confidential voters. So when you are checking through the DEO access, if you can't find somebody, then what you want to do is you want to contact your county clerk, because your county clerk will have information and access to that information. So I always think it's a great idea before an election to talk to your county clerk about what process they want you to use in order for them to be able to determine if somebody is a confidential elector. Lots of times what they will tell you is they will have you scan and email the voter signature from the back of the envelope to a very secure email address. They will verify the information and get back to you. And if the person is, if the signatures match, then again, you put that aside. And then finally, if you have problems with DEO access, you know, what will happen is when you go to apply for DEO access, you will get an email from the Secretary of State's office letting you know what your username is and also letting you know when your password will expire. It's always a good idea to write down when it's going to expire so you can re-up and make sure that it's going to be valid every 90 days. If you're using other people, like for your election judges, they can also use the DEO access. And lots of times in an election, what the Secretary of State's office will do is they'll give you a username that is generic, like, you know, let's see, Lone Tree Judges. And everybody gets to type in Lone Tree Judges, and then you can either give everybody, you are the one who comes up with the password and you can use it. And then that way, after 90 days, the password and the username goes away and you don't need it again until your next election. But it's the Secretary of State's office that will do that. So here's how you apply. You apply to the Secretary of State, and then there is a provision in there that says, ask you to give the legal justification for verifying signatures, and that can be found in 31-10-910.3, and all you have to do is type in that statute where it says, ask for that information, and you should be good to go. And this is old. Obviously, Wayne Williams is no longer the Secretary of State's office, but when we put together this presentation, he was. So you'll see a line at the very bottom where it says request voter lookup access. You can click on that, or you can use the link that I provided to you early on. And then when you go to do the DEO access, this is the way to do it. If you have a voter ID, in other words, if you have the ID that was printed on the envelope, you can type in that number, go down to the bottom and hit begins with, and the individual person will show up. If you don't have a voter ID or you don't want to look it up, I always suggest you type in the first name, the last name, and the number of their address. Because if for those of you who've seen my advanced presentation, when I just type in my name, there are 5 Karen Goldmans registered to vote in the state of Colorado. But there's only one Karen Goldman at the address 6558, and that is me. And so this is what you hit. And then you'll notice here, and let's see if I can, is there a way I can scroll? I wonder if I can scroll down. Let's see. Yeah, okay, so you'll see here under signatures, these are my signatures, and you'll see they're pretty consistent in all these years. It's hard to tell when these years were, but this is probably from my ballot or things like that. And that's how you check my name against. And there are a few variations, but you could see the N, I get that long tail, and you could see my big G and how my D kind of curves to the left. It's pretty consistent over time. And that's how you check signatures. And that is it. So in the time we have remaining, what kind of questions do we have?
All righty. So our first question, let me rearrange myself a little so people can hear me. Our first question is from Stephen. He says, you stated the deadline for notice of intent to write in is 64 days before the election. That is also the deadline for filing nomination petitions. Why would I find an intent to run as a write-in the same day I can file a nominating petition?
I believe unless you have something somewhere different, the deadline for turning in nomination petitions is 71 days before the day of the election. The nomination petition circulation time frame begins on the 91st day before the election and ends the 71st day before the election. And then once you know who the candidates are, it gives people some time to decide if they think they can do a better job and become a write-in candidate. So I'm not sure where you get that 64 days in terms of turning in the petitions for. If you're in a home rule municipality, you might have something different. But if you're following state statute, the nomination petition timeframe is 91 and 71 days.
Okay, our next question is from Christina. She says, if a person who is on the board was appointed doesn't run for the election, can they be appointed again if there aren't enough candidates to fill the open seats?
All of this depends on what you have in terms of term limits. But so if a person is appointed and then and has never been on the board except for that 2 years, doesn't run, wants to be reappointed, I would say that under the provisions of term limits in the Colorado Constitution, that would be permitted.
Okay. Our next question is from Lucy. She says, what if I have 3 full 4-term positions and 1 vacancy for a 2-year term, but I have 4 people running, but 1 wants a 2-year term? Can I cancel the election?
Talk to your attorney. I would say if a person wants a 2-year term, then what that person, this is kind of tongue in cheek, but this is what I would say. First of all, you need to talk with your attorney because remember we had that big discussion about how you deal with, typically 4-year and 2-year terms are determined by the voters. If your attorney says that's what the law says and that's what we have to do, then the person who only wants the 2-year terms needs to get out and tell all the voters to vote for everybody else before they vote for her to ensure she gets the lowest number of votes and can serve the 2-year terms.
Okay. Heather wants to know what the statute number is for the definition of full and short terms. And then in parentheses, she has deciding who gets the seat.
Well, the seat is off the top of my head, I can't answer that question. However, maybe somebody on the listserv will be able to, and when I get to a place where I have statute in front of me, I will be more than happy to look that up and send that out to everybody.
And Michelle asked, what is the process if you have petitions taken out but none returned?
Well, if you have positions taken out and none returned, and I hope against hope that doesn't happen, and you don't get any write-in candidates, then what you've done is you've declared you have vacancy. You will have vacancies in all of your offices once the terms of the current members expire. You will have no elected officials, so you can, if after you determine that if you determine you have no candidates at all, then my suggestion is you make sure that before the current board goes off the board, in other words, when their term ends, that you make sure that they appoint people to fill all of those positions while they are still a valid sitting board. Because once they go off, there's nobody, you have no elected officials. So you've got to do it within that time frame between the time they would, the new people would be sworn in. And you would ask people to apply, and you would fill all the positions by appointment and then deal with the appointments at the next election. I would be very curious for you to follow up and let me know if something like that actually did happen.
Our next question is from Bunny. What statute outlines how to appoint a board member if you don't have enough candidates for open positions?
If you're, again, I don't have the citation in front of me, but if you are a statutory town, you want to go back to Colorado Revised Statutes and you want to go back to the provisions for statutory towns. There is a section in there that talks about how you fill the vacancy. If you're a statutory city, it's a different section, but there is a similar process. So this is a situation where this is self-learning. And you can find find this answer in state statute.
Tiffany wants to know if they use their own, excuse me, their own access code for the election judges to access SCORE, or do we get them their own access?
You won't give them their own access. You'll get one. You'll get one username, and you can use it for all your judges.
So this next one is a long one. It's from Melody, and it says, this is more of a statement than a question. In Garfield County, Colorado, our mail leaves Newcastle and goes to Grand Junction for sorting. It is unclear to us how long it might take for the letter to reach the voters to cure their signature. In the past, we have sent them right away and a few people came to cure, but it is a concern for us and there doesn't seem to be a solution that we can actually implement, particularly if the voters gets the letter after the cure period is over. I suppose we can all we can do is apologize to them. Thoughts? Question mark.
Well, several thoughts. You can work with your post office. You can contact your voter by phone. There's nothing that says you can't email the letter and the form to them as long as you explain when it's back. So there are some options that you can utilize.
Our next question is, appointed person in a 4-year term is required to run at the next regular election. What if all your positions are always 2-year terms?
Then none of this applies, because if all your positions are always 2-year terms and everybody is always elected every 2 years, then you just have an election every 2 years and everybody would be on the same ballot, I guess. The only time you have staggered terms generally by law is if you have 4-year staggered terms. So I would need to know a little bit more about how your municipality operates, and I'm happy to have that conversation just between the two of us offline.
So this is Melanie's first election, and she did not know about the ordinance to file for a write-in candidate. If they have a meeting this week, is it too late to pass an ordinance?
No. Well, it's going to be an ordinance, so you'd have to have 2 readings unless you're a statutory, I can't remember if you're a town or you're a city, you don't have to do 2 readings. If you only have to do 1 reading on your ordinance, then you're good to go. Otherwise, yes, it is too late.
There's a part 2.
Okay.
It says, so that we may cancel our election if we do not have enough to run an election. Does that? Okay.
Yeah, right.
All right. And Christina, what do we do if we can't find people willing to be appointed?
Well, I think that at some point your elected officials need to go out and beat the bushes and help you find people. I know it's a problem in some places, and it depends if you have. I know that some municipalities where they've had 6 trustees. They've looked at the procedure for reducing the number of trustees from 6 to 4, hoping that that will help because they don't have to go out and recruit as many people. But I think this is a situation where you need to put out ads, you need to get your elected officials involved, you really do need to beat the bushes.
If following an election due to a person elected mayor, a majority of your board collectively resigns and you no longer have a quorum, how do you fill the open seats?
Yeah. This is one where I think you need to talk with your attorney to figure that one out. It's definitely a problem. It's definitely a quandary. So I think that that's something you need to talk, and then might even Sursa might be able to help you out with this as well.
Heather Moore provided the statute for the appointing. Would you like that?
Yeah, for statutory towns or cities, do we know which?
It doesn't say, I'm sorry.
Okay, let's hold off on that then.
Okay. That we have one more. It says, could we see the website you had at the beginning of the meeting?
The website.
I think that's the one where you were typing in your information.
Oh, let's see here.
Maybe that one. Cynthia, is that
this
the
one?
page?
This one here. I've given you a link in the handouts themselves to how you get beyond where you request voter lookup. So I'm not sure if this is, and you should have had I'm not sure if this is what you're asking for.
I'm not sure either.
But you can email me later, and we can figure that out.
And this information will be posted to the website
Right.
By the end of this week also.
Right.
So. And another question, where is the handout? I will get that sent to you specifically. It was sent out before the meeting, but I guess you didn't get it. So that looks like all of our questions. Thank you, Karen, for presenting today, and thank you everyone for listening and attending. Once again, we will put the PowerPoint and this recording on our website by the end of the week, and we will also include the attachments that Karen provided for everyone today. So thank you everyone for joining us. This concludes our webinar, and I hope you all have a nice day.